The girl is singing on stage. Suddenly she stops and starts counting the audience. She saw 31 people who would soon be dead. The priest said she was possessed by the devil. He gave her an exorcism. The girl stares at the priest and says, "You're the one who's going to kill these people." Soon after, 31 people died in a mass massacre that shocked the nation. The police concluded that they were poisoned. Instead, 32 suicide notes were found at the scene. The extra note was written by a man. He gave up the poison and took the girl. As he ran away, he told the girl not to look back. The girl said there was something in the dirt over there. She peeled back the dead leaves and pulled out a package. She took out a bell and said it was ringing all the time. The man was dumbfounded because the bell was empty. The girl's name was Jin Dan. She grew up to be a policewoman. A man chased a woman with a baby. Jin Dan thought the man was a trafficker. She quickly subdued him. The child was taken away by another man. The woman begged the man to give her back her child. Jin Dan again thinks he's a trafficker. Jin Dan kicks him in the leg and snatches the child. When she wanted to give the child back to the woman, the man pushes her away. He turned to the woman and asked her what the child's name was and how old she was. The woman couldn't answer. Jin Dan then realized he had made a mistake. Turns out the woman's child died in an accident a year ago. She's been mentally ill ever since. She's been mistaking other people's children for her own. The man's name is Jae-in. He's a detective. He's a legend in the police force. He's responsible for 3 of the top 10 crimes in Korea. He's always ranked first in crime solving rate. His parents died when he was young, and he grew up with his sister. An old man came to the police station in a panic. His daughter had been missing for 4 hours and something might have happened to her. The police impatiently told him to go home and wait for news. But Jin Dan had a bad feeling. The bell in her hand rang again. She saw a woman running desperately in the jungle. She fell down and was grabbed by a man. A man grabbed her and strangled her to death. Her body was hanging from a tree. Her feet were wearing red high heels. Jin Dan woke up from a nightmare. She knew the missing girl had been killed. On the other hand, at the meeting of the crime squad, the police chief labeled the recent hangings as suicides. Jae-in stands up and says it's booby-trapped. He took out 2 cases from a few years ago. The knots used to hang the victims were the same. It's enough to say it's a serial murder case. And the crime scenes were far away from each other. He deduced that the killer was a cab driver. Meanwhile, in the cab, one of the passengers was getting sick of the driver's bullshit. The passenger kicks the driver to shut him up. The driver's mouth twitches with rage. He silently puts on his white gloves. He turns around and stares at the man. A police car was passing by. It made him give up the idea of committing the crime. Jin Dan searched for a day with his psychic memory. She finally came to the hill where the girl was killed. She took out the girl's photo and asked the man about it. When the man saw it, his mouth twitched and he said he'd never seen her before, but it was this gesture that made Jin Dan remember. The murderer's mouth twitched a few times when he committed the crime, so she asked to see the car records. When the man saw Jin Dan's insistence, he said the record was in the computer in the house. While Jin Dan was watching the video, the man quietly closed the door and put on gloves. He wanted to get rid of Jin Dan without a sound. Just in the nick of time, Jae-in broke the window and arrested him as a serial murder suspect. His name is Han Sang-koo. He's mentally strong, unlike other murderers. The polygraph was no match for him. The car was wiped clean of fingerprints. If they don't find any solid evidence within 48 hours, the police will have to acquit him. Jae-in decided to break the ice himself. He noticed Han Sang-koo's neat clothes and cleanliness. He spilled coffee on him on purpose. He was so angry. He got mad at him. When Jae-in wiped his clothes, he realized that his arm had been broken many times. He asked him who hit him. Han Sang-koo's mouth twitched like crazy. He didn't want to remember his past. But under Jae-in's frantic stimulation, Han Sang-koo suddenly calmed down. He said he never killed anyone. He told him not to waste his efforts. Jae-in realized he was something else. He suddenly went under the table and took off his shoes. Han Sang-koo is so clean, but his shoes are dirty. There must be something on it. I was sure there was pollen from the silver lotus flower on the shoes. This flower is only found in a few mountains in Korea. The police mobilized a large number of officers to search the mountain. They finally found the girl's body. Jae-in found the killer's skin under the victim's fingernails. The sheriff also found scratches on Han Sang-koo's neck. His DNA was taken and tested immediately. The old man was devastated by the sight of his daughter's body. Jae-in waited leisurely for the DNA results. This time, he's got it in the bag. But Han Sang-koo was surprisingly calm. He asked him for a set of ribs and started eating. The DNA results came back. Han Sang-koo is not the murderer. Jae-in threw away the data in anger. But Jin Dan knew that Han Sang-koo must be the real killer. He told Jae-in that Han Sang-koo said some strange things during the murder. Jae-in called her delusional and turned back to the interrogation room to release him. Jin Dan rushed in after him, repeating what Han Sang-koo said during the murder. Han Sang-koo was shocked and hit the wall in pain. Jin Dan pulled him to confess. At that moment, the bell in her hand rang again. She saw Han Sang-koo going to a neighborhood to kill a girl again soon. The leader came into the interrogation room and said it was time to release him. Han Sang-ku smiled and left. Jin Dan didn't know how to stop this crime, so he rushed out and drew his pistol on the murderer, and told her that he would continue to kill. But no one believed her, and the murderer just left without a care in the world. Jae-in rushed up and grabbed her gun. He called her an unworthy police officer, but what Jae-in didn't know was that the thing that would make him sad for the rest of his life was about to happen. At night, a girl came to the window. She saw a man staring at her window. At that moment, Jin Dan desperately tried to remember where Han Sang-ku was going. It so happened that her father had worked as a security guard in that neighborhood. A few moments later, the girl came to the window again. She realized that the man in the square had disappeared. This gave her some peace of mind. What she didn't know was that the man was outside her bedroom. Jae-in returned home and walked into the bedroom. He found his sister hanging in the room. He quickly lowered her down. She had stopped breathing. He saw that the weapon used to kill his sister was the same as Han Sang-ku's. He was devastated. Jin Dan rushed to the neighborhood at that moment, but in the end, he was too late. 2 years have passed. Han Sang-ku disappeared and never showed up again. Jae-in resigned from the police force and became a homeless man. He was on the lookout for Han Sang-ku. He also helped out the homeless who were being bullied. But one day, he met a tough guy. He was so nosy that he beat him with a stick. Then Jin Dan, who was passing by, appeared and kicked the man down. Then she turned around and hugged Jae-in, who was about to fall. Jae-in was embarrassed and asked her to let go. Jin Dan said she couldn't do it because Jae-in had stepped on a piece of sheet she just found. Jae-in was shocked. After walking out of the evidence department, Jae-in asked herself the question that's been bothering her for years. How did she accurately predict crimes back then? Jin Dan said she relied on her feelings. Jae-in asked her again why she didn't shoot Han Sang-ku. Jin Dan replied that she was a cop. Jae-in was satisfied with her answer. He went back to his secret base. He took out the weapon that strangled his sister from the box. One day, he'll return the favor. He experienced the pain of losing a loved one and realized that taking the murderer to jail is the least punishment. Jin Dan tells his co-workers about meeting Jae-in. The other co-workers exclaimed that if it wasn't for the wrong sample sent 2 years ago, Han Sang-ku wouldn't have been acquitted. The tragedy that followed wouldn't have happened. After lamenting the incident, they go to an important event. Paekyo-shian, the daughter of a rich family, disappeared for 4 months without a trace. She's been presumed dead by the police. Her father had no choice but to give up the search. A memorial service was held for her in a church without her body. People from politics and business are attending. Meanwhile, in the park, Jae-in was listening to a homeless man's ghost story. Then a woman in a white dress walked down the street. Jae-in was so scared that she fell into someone else's arms. And looking at the girl's swaying steps, Jae-in thought to herself, it can't be that woman. Halfway through the memorial service at the church, a woman covered in blood came in. She shouted with all her strength to ask her father to forgive her. Then she fainted. The plutocrat was shocked to see the woman's face. It was his long-lost daughter. The return of Paekyo-shian has put the police back on their heels. Her blood-stained white dress yielded the DNA of 3 people, all the blood of the recently disappeared woman, and the one with the most blood on it is a college girl who went missing recently. Jin Dan came to the hospital to ask Paekyo-shian for a lead, but Paekyo-shian didn't say a word as if she'd lost her mind. She went to the crime scene to investigate. The landlord said a poor man rented the villa to propose to Paekyo-shian, but Paekyo-shian didn't look happy. While the man was going to the car to get her headache pills, there was a fire in the room. After the fire, Paekyo-shian disappeared, and the man was put in jail as a suspect. In fact, the man was not in a consensual relationship with Paekyo-shian. Prosecutor Ju Haeman learned from the man's notebook that he was stalking Paekyo-shian to find out what she liked, to create the illusion of a love affair. The man was exonerated and acquitted. Then Ju Haeman came to the hospital room to take a statement. Mr. Beek slapped him across the face and told Ju Haeman that he wouldn't allow his daughter's tormentor. He won't allow his daughter's tormentor to live on. On the other hand, Jin Dan found nothing at the villa, but 4 people were kidnapped. Why was she the only one who came back unharmed? That's when her colleague told her. Jae-in had sworn that Paekyo-shian was still alive, but no one believed him. Jin Dan knew Jae-in must have found something important. In exchange, she was willing to tell the truth about what she didn't know 2 years ago. Jae-in agreed to her terms. Then he took her through the process of reorganizing the crime. From Paekyo-shian's suddenly full schedule, she must have found out something and got stimulated. That's why she chose to paralyze herself with her busy schedule. And there was a bottle of liquor at the crime scene. Paekyo-shian's body can't drink this kind of alcohol. She spilled it and made a fire while the man went out to get the medicine and escaped. She must have had some kind of accident while running away. Jae-in has finished his thoughts. Now it's Jin Dan's turn. Jin Dan told him that he can sometimes see the future. That's why he can see crimes that haven't happened yet. Jae-in didn't believe it. He told her that it's an illusion from a scientific point of view, just like sometimes people feel like they've experienced something. In fact, it's just an illusion. Jae-in felt that she was being deceived. She grabbed Jin Dan's hand tightly. The bell on Jin Dan's hand is ringing again. She sees a future where Jae-in will grab Han Sang-ku and kill him with a gun. Jae-in won't get over it. He'll kill himself because he can't stand killing. She told Jae-in not to shoot, but Jae-in thinks she's full of shit because he left the force and doesn't have a gun. Then Jin Dan said that he saw the footage of Paekyo-shian being arrested. The kidnapper was Han Sang-ku. Jae-in couldn't stay calm anymore. Ju Haeman approached Chairman Beek again and told him that his superiors had agreed to his requests. arrest. He'll tell him the conditions after the kidnapping. The police found a lump of suspected murderer in the house of the last missing college girl. The police found a piece of poop that looked like the murderer's. They got an ID from the DNA, but when they got to the house, they realized he was mentally handicapped. He's not capable of committing crimes. Our colleagues were frustrated and withdrew. Jin Dan asked him if he saw anything that night. The man was terrified. He said a monster took the girl. At the same time, Jae-in discovered a surprising feature. The 3 missing girls all went to Cheon-in church. The 2 of them went to the church to investigate. A church van passed by. Jin Dan subconsciously asked the housekeeper who the driver was. The housekeeper said he was a disabled man with burns. Jin Dan realizes that the monster the retarded boy mentioned is actually Han Sang-gu, who is disfigured. They hurriedly drove after him. They realized that the driver wasn't Han Sang-gu. It turns out that the driver had changed shifts, and Han Sang-gu had already run away. Han Sang-ku's trail made the headlines again. Paekyo-shian saw the news and decided to tell the truth. At that time, she realized that her boyfriend had approached her for money, so she purposely set a fire and disappeared. But when she was hiding in the woods, a man was there in advance and knocked her out with a stick. When she woke up, she was taken to a closed room. Jin Dan asked, "What happened to the other 3? Paekyo-shian said they were all dead. The college girl died trying to cover her with a knife. That's why her clothes were splattered with blood." Paekyo-shian was crying in pain, but Jae-in said decisively that she was lying. He spread red dye on the wall to simulate the blood spatter. Then he did some math and realized that only if Paekyo-shian stabbed the college girl with a knife, the blood on her clothes could have been there. Paekyo-shian was dumbfounded by Jae-in's reasoning. For fear of being charged with murder, she could only tell the location of the crime. Jae-in rushed to catch Han Sang-ku, but Jin Dan stopped. He said he had another matter to deal with, because she used her psychic powers to realize that Han Sang-ku was killed by Jae-in in another place. She's going to change the future. Jae-in went to the basement. He only found the dying college girl, but there was no sign of Han Sang-ku. Jin Dan came to the college girl's house. She saw a star ball on the table. When she opened it, the stars filled the room. This is the scene she foresaw when Jae-in committed suicide. That's when Jae-in called and asked where she was. Jin Dan wouldn't say anything, but she didn't realize Han Sang-ku was behind her. He then knocked her out. Jae-in on the other end of the phone heard that Jin Dan had been attacked. He immediately asked the police to check the phone's location. Jin Dan was standing on a stool with a lock around her neck. Han Sang-ku stood in front of her and called her star. "Didn't the 3 of us make a promise when we were kids? How could you forget us?" A vague memory came into Jin Dan's mind, but she just couldn't remember. Han Sang-ku looked a little disappointed. He kicked off the stool. Jin Dan was about to die. Jae-in arrived and kicked Han Sang-ku away. Han Sang-ku grabbed his gun and tried to fight back, but Jae-in grabbed his hand. With the sound of a gunshot, Jin Dan was able to escape from the danger. Han Sang-ku was then pinned to the ground. Jae-in asked him why he killed his sister. Jin Dan yelled at him not to shoot, but Han Sang-ku said he didn't know he killed Jae-in's sister. Jae-in thought that Han Sang-ku killed his sister to get back at him. It turns out there's something else behind it. Jae-in asked him who was behind it. Then other officers arrived. Jae-in took Han Sang-ku hostage to continue the interrogation. Han Sang-ku saw an opportunity and grabbed the gun. Jin Dan joins in and grabs the gun. With a gunshot, Jin Dan was shot in the arm and fainted. Afterwards, Jae-in interrogated Han Sang-ku. He asked him who was behind all this. Han Sang-ku told him it was God's will, and arrogantly said he wouldn't go to jail. Jae-in realized that the person behind him was very powerful. A few days later, Jin Dan returned from her injury. She took Jae-in with her to interrogate Han Sang-ku. She found out that the case had been transferred to the prosecutor's office on an exceptional basis. Han Sang-ku is on his way to the prosecutor's office. Jae-in realized something was wrong. At that moment, Han Sang-ku pulled out a key to unlock the handcuffs. Then he suddenly attacked the security guards. Then he grabbed a gun and stopped the car. Han Sang-ku took a hostage and confronted him, while another officer sneaks around the back. Jae-in and Jin Dan arrived at the same time. Han Sang-ku could have been captured alive. The police suddenly opened fire. Han Sang-ku fell down. While dying, he stared at Jin Dan. He asked Jin Dan not to forget him. Jin Dan suddenly remembered that Han Sang-gu was his childhood friend Apollo. At the end, Han Sang-gu said, "Popeye is waiting for me." At that moment, Jin Dan suddenly saw the image of Jae-in's sister before she died. She left an important message. She drew a picture of what she saw. Jae-in said it was a picture of a duck and a rabbit. It means that people are always fooled by appearances. He took Jin Dan home. It was the first time he'd been home since his sister's death. The home was familiar yet strange. Jae-in searched his sister's room for the book with the duck and rabbit picture, but he couldn't find it. He thinks Han Sang-ku took it. Jae-in went to the newspaper office where his sister worked before she died. A coworker said she was looking for someone, a girl who disappeared 22 years ago. He said that this girl would be a bombshell. Jae-in reorganized the whole case. The sister was killed and her book was stolen because she was investigating someone, and Han Sang-ku was a prop for many murders from the beginning. One more life and no one will suspect him. 2 years ago, the mastermind switched DNA to help Han Sang-ku escape. In return, he helped to kill a man. 2 years later, Han Sang-ku surfaced by accident. The person behind the scene was worried that this time bomb would explode, so they killed Han Sang-ku. The last thing Han Sang-ku said about Popeye was the key to the case. That's when Jin Dan came to him. He told told him that Paek Yoshian was acquitted. It turns out the Zaibatsu bribed the college girl. He bribed the college girl to identify Han Sang-ku as the one who wanted to kill her. The college girl was upset but had to accept the result. Ju Heman took Paek Yoshian's statement. He asked her who stabbed the college girl. Paek Yoshian said it was me. Ju Heman wrote down Han Sang-ku's name. In Paek Yoshian's world, money buys everything. Jae-in ran into Paek Yoshian and was acquitted. He approached Ju Heman and asked him why he was harboring a criminal. Ju Heman said that his assumptions were not evidence at all. According to the law, he could only be acquitted, and he kicked him out for disrespect. Jae-in realized that the case was more complicated than he thought. After Jae-in left, Ju Heman asked Jin Dan what Han Sang-ku said before he died. Jin Dan said he said the name Apollo. Ju Heman was stunned for a moment, then he quickly returned to normal to avoid being discovered by Jin Dan. Jae-in returned to the secret base. Disappointed, he destroyed everything he investigated. Then he said goodbye to his hobo friends. The next day, he went to the police college and found his uncle who was the principal. He used the backstage to regain his identity as a police officer. He returned to the police force with a handsome face. Jin Dan was so crazy about him. Then she received a phone call. The church is burning Han Sang-ku's relics. They arrived in time. They found the missing book in the fire. Jae-in turned to the page with the picture of a duck and rabbit. She found a 22-year-old postcard inside. On the back, it says that the star and Popeye were found. It was signed Apollo. Jin Dan was shocked when she saw the photo. Then she pulled out a photo from her wallet. She looked exactly like herself when she was a child, but she had no memory of being lost. She went home and searched for photos from before she was 7, and there were none. Her father said she'd never been lost. Maybe it's just a resemblance. Jin Dan breathed a sigh of relief. She believed her father's words. The next day, she went to the police station that investigated the girl's disappearance, but she found that the records of the investigation had been deliberately torn out. Jae-in knew there must be a clue behind this. She found out from the police. Her own sister had come to the police station 2 years ago. She even went to an island. Jae-in immediately took Jin Dan to the island. When they brought out the notice, the islanders said they'd never heard of it, but as they walked towards the island, the faces of the islanders became terrifying. The two of them arrived at a bed and breakfast. The grandmother at the door recognized Jin Dan at once. She said, "You're finally back. A child with magical powers can't run around." Jin Dan was dumbfounded. Then the owner came back and said his mother had Alzheimer's, so she said she recognized everyone. Then he checked them in, but when the owner brought in towels, a note fell out of the towel. It said, "Leave the island quickly." They felt very bad, but in the end, they decided to stay. At night, they found the old woman. They asked her if she knew the missing girl. The old man looked at Jin Dan and said, "It's you, isn't it?" and said that Jin Dan's grandmother was the most sacred witch in the neighborhood. At that moment, the islanders arrived. The old woman immediately huddled in fear. Jin Dan went back to his room. She dreamed that she was surrounded by corpses, and her father grabbed her by the neck. She had dreamed this dream many times. Jae-in realized that her cell phone suddenly lost its signal. While he was searching for a signal, a mysterious figure passed by outside the house. The next morning, the old man's body appeared on the beach. A preliminary examination showed red spots on his wrists and a swollen chest. This is a typical symptom of drowning. The islanders said the old man always came to the beach to play. He must have been swept into the water by a wave, but last night was the strongest tide. If the old man lost his footing and fell into the water, his body would have been swept out to sea, and there are signs of movement on the body's feet. Jae-in concluded that the old man was killed. The murderer is one of them. Jae-in sent someone to take the body out of the island for an autopsy. Jin Dan found a foreign object in the old man's mouth. When he pulled it out, he found a piece of paper. Jae-in recognized it as a corner of the Bible. They searched the old man's room for the Bible. When the boss came home, he said that this altar housed the family's guardian spirit. There are many such things in the house. The old man used to worship it all the time. They continued to search the island for clues. They came to a nursing home. Jae-in realized that the guard might be the killer, because he walked exactly like the mysterious man from last night. That's when the old man was killed. We checked the security cameras. The security guard went out at that time last night. Jae-in knew that the guard could be the murderer, but he had no proof. He can only release him temporarily. The two of them continued to wander around the island, but they lost cell phone reception everywhere they went. Jae-in went to the signal tower. He realized that the fiber optic cable had been cut. The whole island was cut off from the rest of the world. The security guard told the village chief that his identity had been compromised. The mayor told him to kill them. Without saying a word, the guard went to the warehouse and took out a shotgun. Meanwhile, the village chief went to the back of the mountain and had 2 graves dug. The time has gone back 22 years. Some kids were playing a ghost game. They didn't realize that they were really attracting something dirty. Jin Dan suddenly held his head. A bunch of strange voices were talking to her. Grandma showed up just in time to chase the kids away. She broke the tree branch in anger and scolded Jin Dan not to play this game, because you can really attract dirt. 22 years later, Jin Dan returned to the same place. The memory of what happened just now suddenly came to her mind. She realized that the missing girl could be herself. The two of them continued to search for clues on the island. They came to the deserted elementary school. Jin Dan followed her memory to a painted wall. Childhood memories flooded into his mind. Popeye gave the girl the most delicious star candy. At that moment, Apollo also came over and took out snacks to share with them. Then the three of them drew their own portraits on the wall. They promised to be best friends for the rest of their lives. Jin Dan was shocked by this sudden memory. Jae-in came over. He found the symbol of Qian church in the ruins. Jin Dan told him about his discovery. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. The nursing home security guards are already here with guns. They pulled out their guns to fight back, but realized the bullets were stolen. They ran for their lives, but they were blocked by the security guards. The owner of the bed and breakfast arrived just in the nick of time. They were able to subdue him. Jae-in thought he caught the murderer. He borrowed the mayor's phone and called his student to pick him up. He told him the autopsy results. The water that drowned the old man was spring water, not seawater. The two of them went to the only place where they could get water from the spring. They found white hair in the water. At night, Jin Dan's hands were extremely tilted. Auntie said she must have gone to the back of the mountain. It's full of lacquer trees. It causes allergic reactions to the skin. After dinner, Jae-in went outside to dig for herbs. She dug up a cardboard box. It was full of cash. Jae-in was so scared. He gave the ground herbs to Jin Dan and told her about his discovery. They decided to put on a show to find the real killer. The next day, when the villagers performed a ritual for the old man, the witch pretended to be possessed by the old man's spirit and told her family about her last days. Jae-in suddenly ran over and held her hand, asking her who the murderer was. The witch looked at the mayor in a difficult situation. The mayor gave her a wink. The witch pointed her finger at the guard inside the house. Jae-in said she was lying. She wasn't possessed by the old man at all, because the murderer can't be the guard. Jin Dan picked up a white flag and did the same thing as the witch, and pretended to talk to the spirit. Then he pointed at the owner of the BB and said he was the murderer. Jae-in rolled up his sleeve. He found traces of lacquer tree allergy. Then Jin Dan pretended to follow beak fans lead to the BB's courtyard. He dug out a Bible from the rice altar. It's the same Bible that the old man chewed on. Jae-in hypothesized that the owner brought the old woman to the water that night. Then he pushed her head into the water. Afterwards, the boss kept reading the Bible and confessing. The old woman, who was still breathing, came over and tore a page out of the Bible and ate it for dinner. Then the boss drowned her again. Afterwards, the Bible was hidden in an altar, a place where a guardian god is said to live. The security guard, who was thought to be the murderer, was actually the old man's son, because the name Lin Tong Shi was written on all the talismans the old man asked for, and Lin Tong Shi is the name of the guard, and he's a hunter and a very good shot. He let them off the hook on purpose. Lin Tong Shi is the scapegoat for all of them. Jae-in took out the money he dug up and threw them all into the air. At that moment, the bell in Jin Dan's hand started ringing. The magic weapon in his hand is also shaking. Jin Dan's consciousness gradually began to drift. Eventually, he lost control. Jae-in was confused, because this part was not in the plan. Jin Dan was really possessed by the old man. At this point, the village chief said that it was all their hard-earned money. Jin Dan said he was lying. Then he sniffed his neck. He said this is all the money he got from grave robbing. The mayor was horrified as if he'd been caught in the act. Then Jin Dan told him that you won't live to see the end of this year. Then Jin Dan went to the farmer's wife. He said she set fire to the shrine. She also killed her husband. Finally, Jin Dan went to Lin Tongxi. He told him not to be fooled by others, and to live a good life. Then she went to the storehouse and took out a basket. She fed him the persimmon cakes she had made. Lin Tongxi knew this was his mother saying goodbye to him. He cried and apologized to his mother. Mother and son embraced each other and cried. Then Jin Dan's body trembled and returned to normal. The murderer rushed over and took her hostage. Jin Dan grabbed his arm. Memory returns to 22 years ago. She realized that the villagers were all involved in the mass suicide. She told Jae-in the secret. That made the villagers want to kill her. The two of them were thrown into a pit and started to fill it with dirt. While they were scared to death, a large number of police arrived and arrested all the villagers. It turns out that when Jae-in called his disciple last time, Jae-in called his disciple to call for backup. Afterwards, Jae-in still didn't believe Jin Dan was possessed by the old man. He thought Jin Dan was schizophrenic. At that moment, the apprentice brought a newspaper. He said that this island is where the mass suicide case happened 22 years ago. Jae-in was surprised. So this is the case Jin Dan was talking about in his invocation. Jae-in has changed her mind about Jin Dan. He started to believe in her special ability. The islanders were arrested as murderers at the police station. Jae-in angrily asked the mayor if they killed his sister. The mayor didn't answer. He said he'd be out soon. Jin Dan cooked a meal for his father. Father was happy to eat. When she said she was on a business trip to Jomo Island, father's movements suddenly stopped. Then he suddenly returned to normal. But Jin Dan noticed the smallest movement. Jin Dan went on to say that there was a grandmother on the island who called him So Yi. It's the same name as on the posters. She asked what was going on. Her father slammed the table in anger and said he didn't know anything. At night, Jae-in went over the case. The mass suicide happened on December the 24th, 22 years ago. The missing person notice was published on December the 25th. That means the girl could be the only survivor. So he had a big theory in mind. He got Jin Dan to analyze the autopsy report of the mass suicide case. The stomachs of the victims were rich in food, but the victims were all malnourished. That means they were fed extra food that day. They ate a lot because they didn't know it was the Last Supper. At 12 o'clock at night, they collectively drank poisonous wine. Jae-in doesn't believe it's all a matter of faith. Jin Dan told of a dream she'd had many times. Many people died around her, and she was standing in the middle of the crowd. Now it seems that it wasn't a dream. Jae-in told Jin-dan that she might be the girl who survived. And how she survived is the key to solving the mystery. Jin-dan has no memory of her childhood. It's hard for her to accept this suspicion. Jin-dan counted the money that Jae-in found on the island. It's a whole $1 billion. The apprentice was surprised to see it. The box containing the money is exactly the same as a recent $7 billion case. At that time, the pastor told the dignitaries on stage, "A high quality of life doesn't mean you're blessed. If you help the poor, you'll be transformed." Then he showed his coat. He said he's been wearing this 100,001 suit for 23 years. Paekyo Xian told Ju Himen with a slight smile. The shoes he's wearing are worth $20 million. After the brainwashing, everyone started making donations. Chairman Beek thinks for a moment and puts 2 billion won in the donation box. The donation boxes were pushed backstage to be counted and packed for transportation to a mysterious location. The truck was involved in an accident. The cash was spilled all over the place. The driver is now in a coma. There's no information on the car. The $7 billion fund has become a mystery. But the Apple case containing the money is exactly the same as the one Jae-in found on the island. Jae-in knew that the money belonged to Chien-in Church. At that time, 6 of the residents arrested on the island took the blame for all the crimes. The rest were acquitted. Jae-in realized that he'd met a mastermind. In order to get him to come forward, Jae-in arranged for someone to go to the TV station and tell them that the money is probably illegal gambling money. If the owner doesn't claim the money by the deadline, he'll turn it over to the National Treasury. Jae-in couldn't have imagined that the money was election money raised by presidential candidate Chu Han-kao. When he saw the news, he dialed Ju Himen's number without any haste. At that moment, Ju Himen was discussing with the pastor and Chairman Beek. It turns out that in this interest group, the pastor is responsible for brainwashing and raising money. Chairman Beek runs the business to launder the money, and all they do is to put Chu Han-kao in the presidential seat. Jae-in gave Jin-dan a few piles of money. Jae-in gave Jin-dan a few piles of money to go to the mall and buy her a high-end men's suit. Then he found his homeless friend and asked him to pretend to be a rich man. The next day, he came to the police station wearing designer clothes. He claimed the money as his own and took it away. The priest was furious at the news, but then Jae-in approached him. He said that if he wanted the money, he should claim it in person and answer the question about the suicide case 22 years ago. If you don't, you'll have to watch the homeless man take the money. The pastor's face turned blue. Jae-in said you have 1 hour to think about it. Then he turned around and left. An hour later, there were footsteps outside the door. I didn't realize that it was the Crown Prosecutor's office. They said they received a report from the public. They said they'd seized all the money as illegal political funds. Jae-in was dumbfounded as the money was taken away. Then Prosecutor Ju Himen came in. Jae-in realized that they're in cahoots. A smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The first fish has finally taken the bait, but he's not capable of doing that alone. Sure enough, a few days later, the prosecutor's office took away all the information on the mass suicide case, and Jae-in was assigned to handle various minor cases. But it was these small cases that gave him a new breakthrough. That day, the robbers grabbed a woman and demanded ransom. Jae-in asked the woman how she got caught. The woman said she thought she was a courier. As soon as she said that, Jae-in came to a conclusion. Not only do you two know each other, but you're also very close. There's no way a woman would dress like this to pick up a delivery. What's more important is that the delivery is not working today. This is a farce staged by the robber and his lover. The second case was reported by a son in the country. He came to town to visit his mother and found her murdered at home. Jae-in didn't investigate anything. He silently scratched a mosquito on the wall. He found his son's DNA in the mosquito's blood. It turns out that the son was unhappy that his mother gave away her fortune and killed her. The third case was even more outrageous. Only a woman's right leg was found. This made it impossible to identify the victim. Jae-in took one look at the neat wound and came up with a conclusion. The murderer was skillful with a scalpel and left-handed. The police narrowed down the investigation through this clue. They arrested the victim's husband, who was a doctor. In just a few days, Jae-in solved almost all of the bureau's unsolved cases. There's only one case left to solve. The red light district trade case. Jae-in looked through the books he found. He saw a familiar name on it. It's the Inspector General of the prosecutor's office. The Inspector General said he's retiring soon. He begged him to let him go. Jae-in didn't want to miss this opportunity. He asked him to give him the information on the mass suicide case in exchange. Otherwise, he'll do his job. So Jae-in managed to get the information. And he got the information. There's a lot of information in there. He told Jin-dan that 31 people committed suicide at the orphanage. Mr. Beek was the director of the orphanage. The pastor was that bald guy. Chu Han-kao, the current presidential candidate, was in charge of the case. Not only were they not punished, they became powerful men. In addition, there's a complete list of the dead in the investigation report. Jae-in decided to look for clues from the families of the deceased. Unbeknownst to the two, their conversation was overheard by the mole. Jin-dan contacted the sister of one of the victims. He made an appointment on the phone, but when they arrived at the scene, They refused to meet. The next few people they contacted all had the same reaction, but Jin Dan wasn't going to give up. She wrote a letter to the grandmother, but Jae-in thought that something was wrong. Someone must have gotten to her first. So she went straight to the newspaper to find the families of the mass suicides. An old man saw it when he was picking up junk. He contacted Jae-in. He said he sold his son's motorcycle. His son left home in a rage. 4 months later, he got the news of his son's suicide, but before that, he received a letter from his son. He said he wanted to learn a trade and start a new life. Jae-in analyzed the old man's son's suicide. He decided to do an autopsy on the old man's son. The old man was struggling to climb the hill with his junk. Then a kind young man helped him up the slope. Then he gave him a bottle of water. Just as he was about to drink, Jae-in came over. He spilled the old man's water on the spot. He smelled it and realized it smelled like potassium. The man who gave him the water was long gone. Jae-in told him what he wanted to do. The old man agreed to tell him the location of the grave. But then there was a change in the police department. The superiors ordered a full investigation into the corruption case. Jae-in and Jin Dan were asked to come back. Jae-in went straight to the TV station. He got the TV station to expose the mass suicide case overnight, and the next day, they opened the coffin live. When the coffin was opened, the Taoist priest said it was bad. The bones and the roots of the tree were tightly intertwined. This is a sign of impending disaster. As expected, presidential candidate Chu Han Kao came to the police station. On the surface, he was inspecting the work, but his eyes were glued to the news of the mass suicide on TV. Jae-in rushed to the police station. When he heard about the leader's visit, he was surprised to see Chu Han Kao. He said he likes to fish all the time. He didn't expect to catch a big fish today. Chu Han Kao was not shy either. He said fishing depends on the current. Otherwise, you'll lose money and get hurt, meaning if you don't obey me, you could lose your life if you don't obey me, and Jae-in had nothing to lose. The meeting ended in a firestorm. On the other hand, the medical examiner found an important clue. Although there was hydrogen chloride in the victim's body, but the cause of death was not suicide. The victim's neck was broken. This is the technique used by spy soldiers. This reminds Jin Dan of a dream. Her father almost broke her neck. The coroner said that the prosecutor in charge of the autopsy 20 years ago was the current presidential candidate, Chu Han Kao. Jae-in realized why the autopsy report was a suicide. It must be Chu Han Kao's handiwork. Jin Dan's father saw that the mass suicide investigation was reopened, so he secretly burned something at night. Then he buried them in the ground, but he didn't realize Jin Dan was behind him. After he left, Jin Dan threw open the pit. She dug out the symbol of the Church of Divine Mercy. This convinced her that her father was involved in the mass suicide. On the other hand, Chu Han Kao asked Ju Heman to dinner. He said he had 2 months to run for the election. As long as he becomes president, the mass suicide case will be sealed forever. He asked Ju Heman to throw a decoy to infiltrate Jae-in. He made sure that nothing would go wrong in the next 2 months. The next day, Ju Heman met with Jae-in and told him that his superiors had ordered him to investigate Chu Han Kao's suspected embezzlement. He wanted to work with him on the case. He also showed his sincerity by presenting another part of the mass suicide case. Jae-in knew he wanted to be a double agent, but he agreed to do it to get the information. Then Jae-in chose someone he trusted from the police department to form an investigation team to secretly investigate the mass suicide case. They started their first meeting. Jae-in took out the file and played it. The video was shot before the case. At that time, Mr. Beek built an orphanage. The orphanage housed a large number of homeless people. The pastor was responsible for brainwashing them twice a week. Then came Jin Dan from her childhood. She suddenly stopped and counted the audience. She said 31 people were going to die, but this video was shot before the murder. This prophecy sent chills down the crew's spine. Jae-in has seen Jin Dan's clairvoyance before and is not surprised. Ju Heman gave us another clue. The people in the orphanage didn't commit suicide by poison. They were killed by the filmmaker of the video. Although the video was blurry, Jin Dan recognized his father's silhouette. In order to confirm her suspicion, she volunteered to find someone to fix the video. But on the way, she witnessed a man fall to his death, and it was this fall that put the case back on the map. Then a puppy licked Jin Dan's bell. Jin Dan managed to read its memory. He was originally a stray dog, until he met a kind man. That day, he witnessed a fight between the man and a woman on the balcony. The man was pushed down the stairs. The dog even bit the woman. Jin Dan told Jae-in about the memory she read. She said the man didn't commit suicide, but Jae-in believes she's useless. It's not evidence. The next day, the two of them went to the funeral of the deceased. They tried to find clues from the family. They heard the song, Gate of Heaven, playing in the funeral hall. Sure enough, it's the symbol of Qian in church again. The victim's sister rushed into the funeral hall and slapped her sister-in-law across the face. She said she had killed her brother. Xiao Fang told Jae-in that she and her husband were very much in love. He couldn't have committed suicide, and that her sister was a regular attendee at the Church of Heavenly Mercy. She used her faith as an excuse to oppose the autopsy. On the other hand, Jin Dan was surprised to find out that the deceased's sister was a member of the Tianjin Church, and because the brother did not go to church, she had many arguments with her brother over his non-attendance. Most of all, they had a lawsuit over the family fortune. Jin Dan saw a wound on her foot, but her sister said it was caused by a traffic accident. This is too much of a coincidence. Jin Dan decided that her sister was the murderer. The wound on her foot must be from a dog bite. She's is harboring a grudge against the autopsy. The motive was based on her brother's property. Xiao Fang doesn't look like she's capable of murder. On the other hand, the mass suicide case continues to be investigated. Jae-in found an important clue. There were 5 boys and 2 girls in the orphanage. These children were not on the death list. One of them is Han Sang-koo, who died recently. So could the others have been used to work for the triads? The Popeye that Han Sang-koo mentioned before he died is definitely someone who works for the trio. The next day, Jae-in went to see Xiao Fang. He found out that Xiao Fang had been married 3 times. The first 2 husbands died in accidents. This is too suspicious. During the conversation, he accidentally touched Xiao Fang's arm, but he realized that there were multiple fractures. This gave Jae-in a strong sense of familiarity. Jin Dan tried to look for clues in the church. Instead, he saw the pastor brainwashing the orphans. This scene is exactly the same as when he was a child. The pastor told Jin Dan that there was a black shadow behind her. There's a black shadow behind her back. It's a sign of a curse. If it's not broken, it's a sure sign of trouble. Jin Dan asked him if he'd said something similar to the victim's sister. That's why the other party sent all the family's assets to him. The priest was speechless. At night, Jin Dan found Xiao Fang. He said her husband's death might be related to the priest. He asked her to tell him everything she knew. At that moment, Xiao Fang suddenly received a phone call. After hanging up, she mumbled that she was cursed. Then she went up to the balcony and tried to jump off. Jin Dan rushed to catch her, but he found 3 ghosts under her feet. You've killed 3 men in total. Then he touched her stomach and said, it's all because of your sins. You've caused the baby to die before it was born. Xiao Fang looked incredulous. This is all too accurate. So she grabbed Jin Dan by the collar. She wanted to throw her off the balcony. She didn't realize that Jin Dan's quick counterattack would put her in danger. Xiao Fang was very confused. How could the other party be so strong after drinking the drugged coffee? In fact, when she answered the phone, but Jin Dan quickly stuck a pen into the palm of her hand. That's how she stayed awake. Jin Dan wanted to throw her down, but in the end, he decided to let her face the law. On the other side, Jae-in took out the children's photos. He discussed with Ju Himin how to find them. He noticed that one of the girls had 3 moles at the corner of her eyes, but it reminded him, Xiao Fang also had 3 moles at the corners of her eyes. Jin Dan extracted DNA from Xiao Fang and the puppy's teeth. The DNA from Xiao Fang's teeth and the puppy's teeth were a perfect match. It broke Xiao Fang's alibi. Then Jin Dan took out photos of her 2 previous husbands to shed light on the suspicious nature of their deaths. Xiao Fang soon confessed to all the crimes. She killed 3 husbands and swindled $4 billion in insurance money. But Xiao Fang didn't talk about the whereabouts of the money. Then Jae-in told Jin Dan, Xiao Fang was one of the 7 children in the orphanage. The money should have gone to the Qian in church. Jin Dan was in disbelief. Jae-in interrogated him himself. He asked Xiao Fang if she knew Popeye and the priest. Xiao Fang said he'd never heard of them. Jae-in said, you were raised by a priest. How can you not recognize them? If you're not honest, I'll bring in the priest. Xiao Fang's face was full of disdain. Jae-in said that the pastor had already been arrested. Then he took Xiao Fang to another interrogation room. The priest was being questioned. He told Xiao Fang that if he confessed to Popeye's identity, and the pastor would walk away unharmed. Xiao Fang's attitude changed instantly, and agreed to Jae-in's request. It turns out that during the day, when the pastor was doing charity work, Jae-in asked his homeless friend to create a mess. Then he stole the pastor's wallet. The pastor was just here to give a statement and find the wallet. As promised, Xiao Fang started to explain the case. Popeye was a very smart man. The other kids used to get beat up because they couldn't memorize their texts, but he always memorized the text fast and well. And Han Sang-koo was the one who was beaten the most, but he and Popeye were very good friends. Xiao Fang started to explain the orphanage's way of making money. The director threw the steamed buns on the ground. Whoever wins the fight can take it away. Han Sang-koo chose to go for the buns. The opponent doesn't want to fight, so he dodges in time. Han Sang-koo fell to the ground. The dean felt his arm and realized it was only dislocated, so he broke his arm. The director then called the insurance agent to settle the claim. The insurance agent realized that Han Sang-koo was often injured. Before he could say anything, he already knew. He fell from playing the bar again. Then he asked the girl next to him how she got hurt. Xiao Fang was forced by the director to say she fell down the stairs. The dean couldn't wait to ask how much the compensation was. The insurance agent said it was $4 million. This is how the orphanage makes its money. Jae-in couldn't wait to ask Popeye's name. Xiao Fang said she couldn't remember. She said that one of them was special. She came with her mother. Her name was Star. That's when a memory flooded Jin Dan's mind. She suddenly remembered that she had a mother, but her appearance was extremely vague. Xiao Fang continued. The only warmth in his life was the priest, who used to come to the orphanage to bring them bread and comfort them. In the long run, he became a fatherly figure. Finally, Xiao Fang said he had nothing to do with the priest. He wanted to raise money to donate to the church to atone for his sins. Xiao Fang's incorrigible appearance made Jae-in give up her interrogation. At night, Ju Himin went to visit Xiao Fang. He said the pastor had put her on the ascension list. He told her not to talk about the past. Xiao Fang was very excited. She waved goodbye to him when she was leaving, and said goodbye to Popeye. Ju Himin was slightly stunned, so she already knew his identity. Then Ju Himin and Jin Dan discussed the case together. At that moment, the deliveryman's car lost control and crashed into him. Jin Dan pounced on Ju Heman in time. He lost his wallet by accident. Ju Heman picked up the wallet. He saw Jin Dan's childhood photo. He realized she was the star he had been looking for. On the way home, Ju Heman couldn't contain his excitement any longer. Jae-in couldn't figure out what these people were planning, turning children into monsters one by one. The next day, presidential candidate Chu Han Kao gave a speech. The pastor brought the orphans to the venue. The children went up to the stage and asked Chu Han Kao to become president, to create a nation of dreams. The children became a tool for his show. Jin Dan was very angry when she saw this. She grabbed the pastor and told him to stop. At that moment, a bell rang on her hand. Then she saw the pastor asking a group of people to jump to their deaths. Then she stared at the priest with anger and accusing him of the crime of killing again. The priest was shocked by her words, that she had predicted what he was going to do. It reminded him of the girl 20 years ago, the same girl who predicted that he was going to kill 31 people. Back at the church, the priest was in a good mood. He'd found the missing girl. Then he'd find the man who'd taken her, and the man had smuggled a classified videotape with him. So the priest sent his butler to the woman's house, in the name of missionary work. When Jin Dan's father saw that he was from Chian Jin Church, he knew his identity had been exposed. He took out his pistol and tried to open the door. At that moment, the butler thought no one was home and left. Then he took the videotape and hurried out. He put it in a locker for safekeeping. The data on the other side has been restored. Jin Dan was sure his father was the photographer, one of the murderers of 31 people. So she went back to the police station to look up her father's information. She found out that her father's name was Kim Jong-swa. He was first on the list of mass suicides. Jin Dan went home and confronted her father. Jin Dan went home and confronted her father with the fact that he was an accomplice, and he slapped her across the face. He told her to pack her things and get out of the house. Jin Dan walks helplessly on the street, and Jae-in, as if he had predicted it, he drove over and picked her up. Then he texted Jin Dan's father to tell him he was okay. Jin Dan's father was heartbroken, but he knew that if Jin Dan didn't leave the house, her life could be at stake. In order to further investigate Tian Ren Church, the two men went to the church to play with the children, trying to get the inside story from the children. Jin Dan asked the children if they had ever been beaten. The boy said the pastor was like a father to them. Jae-in touched his arm. There was no sign of a broken bone. At that moment, the girl gave a strange sign. If it rains on Sunday night at 12 o'clock, the bronze statue of the maiden in their yard would come back to life. Then she came into the room and took the children away. Jae-in, who only believed in science, it was all a child's nightmare. He didn't give it a second thought, but he didn't expect it. At 12 o'clock that night, there was a sudden storm outside. The boy saw a shadow flashing. When he tried to find out what was going on, he was really taken. Jin Dan woke up in a flash. She knew something must have happened to the boy, so she immediately drove to the orphanage. She searched the dormitory and found that the boy was gone. The girl pointed to the bronze statue of a young girl outside. She said she took the boy. Jae-in didn't see any sign of movement in the statue. The priest came to the scene. Jae-in suspected that he had taken the boy. The pastor stammered and denied it. He denied it and said that the orphanage has never lost a child. Jae-in watched the security camera again and again, but there's not a single clue. Then Ju Heman brought over a bunch of information. This isn't the first time the orphanage has lost a child. Before that, there were 4 other missing children. In order to find the missing boy quickly, Jae-in sent the others away. Then he asked Jin Dan to perform a psychic spell. Jin Dan took the piece of paper the boy gave her and closed her eyes. At that moment, a bell rang. Her consciousness came to the boy's side instantly. She saw the hospital ambulance through the window. The name of the ambulance was Songha Hospital. Jin Dan finished talking and fainted from the energy. Jae-in left her in the care of Ju Heman. It turns out that Songha Hospital is owned by Mr. Beek. His daughter Paek Yoshan is Chu Han Ka's assistant. In order to get Chu Han Ka's rival to quit, she teamed up with the orphanage to bring the boy in to replace the organs of another terminally ill child. The boy's grandfather was one of the presidential candidates. By this time, the boy had already been rushed into the operating room. Jae-in arrives at the room, which is empty, so he triggered the fire alarm with a lighter to stop the operation. Chairman Beek heard the alarm and ran away with his daughter. He ran into the police. Paek Yoshan was taken away by the police for investigation. On the other hand, Ju Heman was watching over the sleeping Jin Dan and couldn't help but tell him what happened when he was a child. But she didn't realize that Jin Dan was pretending to be asleep. She realized that Ju Heman was her childhood friend Popeye, so she asked him why he was working for the bad guys. Ju Heman grabbed her hand and stuck it in his chest. He said he didn't want to live the day she disappeared. Jin Dan suddenly realized what happened 20 years ago. After the murder of 31 people, I was the one who hid Ju Heman, but Ju Heman was found by Chu Han Kao, who arrived. In order to survive, he had to obey Chu Han Kao, but Jin Dan couldn't tolerate him working for the bad guys. He gave him 3 days to turn himself in, otherwise, he would be arrested. Afterwards, Jin Dan told Jae-in about it. Jae-in said that Ju Heman seemed to be changing for the better. At least he was sincere in saving the boy with the information. On the other hand, Chairman Beek found Chu Han Kao. He asked him to try to save his daughter. Chu Han Kao replied that he has to wait until after the election. Mr. Beek made a stern statement. If anything happens to his daughter, everyone will have to die with her. Chairman Beck's fearlessness. He gave Chu Han Kao a bad feeling. Chairman Chairman Beek then called his bodyguards to arrest Jin Dan's father. He didn't expect to catch Jin Dan by accident, so he called Jae in by mistake. He said he had something with Jin Dan's father. If he can get it, he'll let Jin Dan go. Jae guessed that the item was an important video, so he proposed to split up into two groups. He took the fake tape to save Jin Dan. Ju Heman will find the real videotape. At this moment, Chairman Beek has lost his essence under Jin Dan's excitement. He desperately choked her. Jin Dan's psychic skill was triggered. She saw the secret of Chairman Beck's heart. Then she said you had an illegitimate son, but he died before he was 2 years old. Chairman Beek was shocked. No one knew about it. Jin Dan continued, if you continue your evil ways, your daughter will also die. Chairman Beek grabbed her by the collar and asked who she was. How did she know all this? At that moment, Jin Dan returned to normal. She looked confused and didn't know what she said. Mr. Beek had his men put Jin Dan in a room. That's when Jae arrived. Mr. Beek asked him to hand over the goods. Jae said he couldn't take such an important thing with him. He wanted to make sure Jin Dan was safe. When he got to the room, he winked at Jin Dan. He indicated that the key to the handcuffs had been thrown to the floor. Then he took Mr. Beek to the video library. He took out the videotape that was stored there. It was supposed to contain evidence of the crime. But when Mr. Beek looked at it, it wasn't there at all. Mr. Beek was furious and wanted to kill him. The police arrived at the scheduled time and arrested Chairman Beek. On the other hand, Jin Dan's father's location was found. He's now at Cheon in church. Ju Heman drove there immediately. Jin Dan's father planned to kill the pastor to atone for his sins. Ju Heman arrived and told him to stop. He said Jin Dan was in danger. He asked for the videotape in exchange. He recognized Ju Heman as Jin Dan's friend, so he put down his weapon and took him to get it. But when Ju Heman got the tape, he immediately informed Chu Han Kao. Then he pulled out his weapon and pointed it at Jin Dan's father, and confessed that he was Popeye, and he remembered this guy from across the street. Everyone was afraid of him at the orphanage, but Popeye was the only one who wasn't afraid of him. He vowed to return the favor one day. Jin Dan's father kneeled down and offered to pay with his life. If only he could save his daughter. Ju Heman left with the videotape. He handed Jin Dan's father over to a group of thugs. On the other hand, Jin Dan secretly unlocked her handcuffs. She knocked out her guards and escaped. Then she hurriedly called her father to meet him. Jin Dan was very happy to see her father safe and sound. When her father saw the wound on the corner of Jin Dan's mouth, he wiped away the blood. Then he told her to eat well. He had a lot of food stored in the refrigerator. Then he handed Jin Dan a note. She told her that if she had any problems, she should go to the address on the note. The people there can help you. After saying that, she fell down and collapsed. Jin Dan tried to help her father up, but her hands were covered in blood. It turned out that his father had been seriously injured. Jin Dan cried her heart out. At that moment, her father grabbed her hand with his last strength. The bell on Jin Dan's hand rang. All the memories of her childhood flooded into her mind, as if the seal had been lifted. Go back 22 years. Jin Dan's mother said her daughter could see dirty things. She begged the priest to help her heal her daughter. At that moment, Jin Dan advised her to leave. If you stay here, your life will be shortened. This made the mother even more afraid. The priest said, don't worry. He can take care of everything. So the two of them went to live in the orphanage. But once inside, they realized that life here was hell. Every day, the priest would brainwash everyone and drive them crazy. The director made the children test drugs for the pharmaceutical company and broke their arms and legs to cheat the insurance. The adults were made to work for them. They did all kinds of work to help make money. Gradually, someone realized something was wrong and tried to escape, but all the people on the island helped him. Soon he was captured by Butler Kim and handed over to the headmaster to be beaten to death. After beating him to death, he was sent to Butler Kim for public treatment as a deterrent. Butler Kim was also a victim. When he heard the rumor, he brought his daughter to the priest. He begged the priest to cure his sick daughter. The pastor recited some mysterious words. He put his hand on the girl's head, and the girl came back to her senses. Butler Kim took it as a credit to the priest. He was so happy that he bought his daughter a pair of pink shoes. When he came back, she had stopped breathing. He took all the money and begged the priest to help him again. The priest said it was his lack of faith that caused all this. If he stayed and practiced to open the gates of heaven, then he could meet his daughter. Butler Kim carried away his daughter's belongings in a state of shock. He accidentally dropped the photo on the floor. Jin Dan picked it up and returned it. He held his hand and told him not to be sad. Your daughter is watching from heaven. From then on, Butler Jin stayed behind and became a fighter for the orphanage. He would beat up anyone who didn't fulfill his duties, but he never hit Jin Dan. But in this dark environment, the children still formed friendships behind the scenes. Apollo and Popeye made a pact to be best friends for life. They would never forget each other when they grew up. That day, Jin Dan's mom was cleaning the dean's house. She saw a news report about a righteous prosecutor who speaks out for the people, so she wrote a letter exposing the orphanage's inner workings. She had everyone sign it. Then she took it out through Popeye, the only one who was eligible to go to school. But this letter of denunciation led to the mass death of the 31 people behind her. Then prosecutor Chu Han Kao came to the orphanage to investigate. Everyone cheered and welcomed him. Chu Han Kao went to the director's office. He took out the letter he received. Instead of repenting, the pastor called them ungrateful. He called them ungrateful. It was enough to put them in jail. Chu Han Kao said he had a solution for them. Turns out the head of Chu Han Kao's faction accidentally impregnated an actress, and Chu Han Kao, a newcomer to the political scene, has been tasked with fixing it. At that time, Chu Han Kao received a letter from the orphanage. He has a vicious plan in mind. He wants to kill the actress and the people in the orphanage together, in order to cover up the truth. On that day, the actress was tricked into giving birth to a baby. The priest apologized to everyone. He said he didn't know what the director was doing. He dismissed him from his post. He said he would compensate everyone for the loss of property. The pastor gained everyone's trust again after this act. On the day before Christmas, the children put on a show for everyone. At that moment, Jin Dan predicted the death of everyone. The pastor was scared and decided to go ahead. He told the butler that he would poison everyone tonight. He told him to stay there and finish the job. When everyone is dead, he'll take the poison and kill himself. Then the gates of heaven will open. Then he could be reunited with his daughter. The butler believed him. That night, the priest treated everyone to a full meal. Popeye poured a glass of poisoned wine for everyone. Under the priest's compulsion, they drank it all. Then everyone started spitting blood. The abbot took advantage of the situation and locked the doors. Then he left with the priest. The butler examined the bodies one by one. He broke the necks of those who didn't die. Jin Dan found Popeye, who was scared out of his wits. He hid Popeye when Butler Jin wasn't looking. Then she walked into the hall where the bodies were strewn. When Butler Jin saw her, he planned to kill her, but he saw his daughter in her. Butler Kim realized he had made a big mistake. He reached for the poisoned wine, but Jin Dan stopped him. Then Butler Jin gave up on suicide. He found a videotape that recorded everything. He carried Jin Dan in his arms and ran away from the mountain. And Jin Dan lost his memory because of the shock. Popeye was found first by prosecutor Chu Han Kao. Chu Han Kao took out a packet of poison and asked him to choose between obedience and death. Popeye had to choose between obedience and death. In the end, Chu Han Kao's operation turned the case into a mass suicide of 31 people that shocked the nation. Jin Dan said he remembered everything from his childhood. Butler Jin died after hearing that, but Jin Dan already thought of him as his father. On the other hand, Ju Heman returned to the base. He said the videotape had been given to Chu Han Kao. He told him not to bother anymore. He said he was Popeye. Jae-in didn't realize that Popeye, who was one of the victims of the crime, was willing to be a lapdog. Jin Dan held a funeral for his father. The priest handed the butler a photo and told him to get rid of the people on it. Since his father's death, his spirit has been following Jin Dan, and Jin Dan thought his father wasn't dead. He talks to the air all day long. Jae-in is getting scared just watching him. In order to get Jin Dan out of his state of mind, he took out the address Jin Dan's father left behind. He went to the countryside, far from the city. An old man came out of the house. The old man looked like he expected them to come today. He said he had prepared tea. She told Jae-in to drink it and leave. Jae-in asked her who she was. The old woman said she was Jin Dan's grandmother. He was shocked that this famous witch was still alive, so he left in peace. She let Jin Dan in. She saw a group of undead behind her. Jin Dan was helping her with the farm work. When she looked up, she saw her father covered in blood. Grandma hurriedly told her that it wasn't your father. It's a group of undead with a grudge. Don't say yes to the spirits when they call you, otherwise, you may end up in hell. At night, when she was sleeping, Jin Dan suddenly heard her father calling her. She rushed out and hugged him. He asked her to take a walk with him. Jin Dan subconsciously supported her father, but she realized that her father, who used to be legless, was now walking like a horse, but she's starting to limp. Jin Dan struggled to catch up with his father. She realized that her father had turned into another ghost. Then all the victims of the mass suicide appeared. They stared at Jin Dan. Jin Dan cried and apologized to them. She said she couldn't save them. Her father knelt down and whispered to her that she was very hot. Jin Dan woke up from her dream. She realized that the fire was raging outside. All the doors and windows were blocked. Jin Dan used all her strength to break down the door. She escaped with her grandmother. Jin Dan observed the traces on the ground. She realized that someone had set the fire on purpose. Grandma realized it. No wonder Butler Kim was following Jin Dan. Jin Dan broke down in tears of guilt. So his father was protecting him even after his death. Jin Dan got back on her feet. She's going to make sure all the bad guys are punished. Grandma told her to go back and fight. She gave her the bell in her hand. Jin Dan didn't reach for it, because she didn't need the bell to see the future. The 32 spirits looked at her with hope and made way for her. She's going back to overturn the mass suicide case. That day, Jin Dan handed Jae-in a handkerchief. Jae-in was about to ask why. One of the kids poured water all over him. Jae-in hurriedly dried himself, but then he suddenly remembered that Jin Dan gave him this cloth. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes. Jin Dan was staring at the ceremony. Paekyo Xian looks at the chandelier with a grudge. The chandelier suddenly broke loose, killing several adults on the spot. Jin Dan again sees what's about to happen. She realized that it was a well-planned accident. Sure enough, when the presidential candidate took the stage, the waiter pushed the button on the wall. The chains of the chandelier gradually began to fall off. Jin Dan told Jae-in. Paekyo Xian was about to kill everyone, so Jae-in immediately fired a warning shot. The chandelier came down after everyone was scared away. If it wasn't for Jin Dan's prophecy, it would have been difficult for them to escape. It turns out that during Jin Dan's absence, Chairman Beek had been abandoned by the priest and Chu Han Kao. He turned himself in to take the blame for his daughter's crime. The daughter also cooperated with him. She put the blame on her father and got her freedom, but Chu Han Kao wasn't going to let him go. He used a trick to get Paik Xian and Zhu Heman engaged, so that he could take over the Baek family business. And Paik Xian was not as weak as she appeared, although she agreed to the engagement ceremony, but she was secretly planning an accident. But when Jin Dan arrived, it was all for naught. The two of them came to the detention center to tell Chairman Beek about the incident. Mr. Beek was worried that his daughter was getting in deeper and deeper. He told them that the pastor had a book of revelations, a record of all the dirty money, but only the pastor and his close associates know where it's hidden. On the other hand, Zhu Heman sent an order from Chu Han Kao, tell them all to get rid of Jae-in as soon as possible. At that moment, Jae-in was drunk in the alley. He was suddenly taken away by two men in black. When he woke up from his sleep, he realized that the owner of the gold store was injured, and he was covered in gold. Jae-in screamed that he was wrongly accused, but he was still bombarded by the media. He became a disgrace to the police force overnight. His superiors sent him to prison as a felon. Even the inmates in his dormitory have special arrangements. They're all his former inmates. Jae-in, who was beaten up, laughed. He met the village chief as planned. The mayor told Jae-in that the end is near. Only the chosen one can enter the kingdom of heaven, and Jae-in will soon show her who the real God is with her actions. At night, the mayor washed his hands after going to the toilet. He realized that what came out was blood. The mayor couldn't believe his eyes, but when Jae-in came to drain the water turned back to normal. The mayor panicked, because this phenomenon corresponds to one of the 10 disasters of blood and water. The next day, Jae-in placed an envelope on the ground. Soon the lice in the envelope crawled all over the cell. The inmates were itching like crazy. The mayor shivered as he held the book, because the plague of lice had come true. Soon after, something strange happened again. While cleaning the bathhouse, they found a large number of locusts, and the locusts corresponded to the plague of locusts. The mayor was already scared and began to doubt his life, and all of this was done by Jae-in with the help of someone from the outside. He's trying to break down the chief's psychological defense and make him afraid. When there's a crack in his faith, it's the perfect time to break him. Soon the time is ripe. Jae-in came over to tell the mayor. He's already sent someone to contact Chu Han Ka's political rival. As soon as he's out of the picture, he would give them the Book of Revelation. It contains all of Chu Han Ka's books. The mayor was surprised and asked him how he knew the address of the books. Jae-in asked him if he remembers Jin Dan, the woman with psychic powers. The mayor was horrified. Jae-in packed his things with confidence. The prison guards came to announce his acquittal. Jae-in, who was convicted of robbery, left in a state of confusion, but they didn't know that just a few hours ago, the owner of the gold store suddenly came to the police station and confessed that he didn't really rob the gold store that night. Jae-in asked him to do a burglary act. That's why Jae-in was acquitted. The mayor really thought he had the secret of the apocalypse. He rushed to Zhu Heman and told him that Jae-in was on his way to find the apocalypse. Zhu Heman immediately reported this to the priest. Jae-in had already set up a wire in the meeting room and found out that the apocalypse was inside the church. The two of them rushed to Qian in church. Jin Dan suddenly pulled him back and told him to be careful with the car, but Jae-in saw nothing. It turns out what Jin Dan saw was from a few months ago. The village chief came here to pick up Revelation. The Revelation was the money book they were looking for. The two of them followed the car to the Qian in church branch. Following the mayor's footsteps, Jin Dan went through a corridor. Inside the church, he lost the mayor's image. Jin Dan covered his head and did it again. He points to the cross and says it's underneath. Jae-in grabbed a stool and smashed it through the floor. He found the book of the apocalypse. While they were taking the evidence back to the police station, Zhu Heman came in with a gun in his hand. He asked Jae-in to hand over the revelation. Jin Dan blocked the way. He said he'd kill her if he wanted to take it. Memories of her childhood come to mind. Zhu Heman couldn't do it, so he turned his gun around and shot Jae-in in the heart. Jae-in was killed instantly. Jin Dan was in a cold sweat because of what was about to happen. When Zhu Heman turned his gun around, he grabbed his gun first, then he knocked him to the ground. Zhu Heman could only watch as the two men left. The next day they held a press conference to expose the money laundering of the church and released the account books to the public. The pastor laundered $47 billion. All the money was transferred to a dignitary's account. Chu Han Kao was devastated when he saw the news. 20 years of hard work had come to naught. Then Zhu Heman came to calm him down. He said Jae-in didn't name the dignitary. Because a single account book can't convict him. Jae-in was really trying to make a fool out of himself. He got the elders of Qian in church together and asked them to testify that they gave money to Chu Han Kao. In the face of Jae-in's evidence, businessmen are turning on Chu Han Kao. Chu Han Kao's side received the news quickly, but Zhu Heman said that there's still room for maneuver. He asked Chu Han Kao to admit that he received the money. He'll take care of the rest. Chu Han Kao held a public press conference and apologized to everyone, admitting that he got all the money. The press was in an uproar. Then Chu Han Kao broke down in tears, said he didn't know the money was coming from the wrong place. He had failed the people and was willing to withdraw from the election. Then the actor came on stage and said that he had been cheated out of his family's money and was living on the streets. Chu Han Kao rented a house for his family. Then another actor came on stage and said that his daughter was terminally ill. Chu Han Kao paid all her medical bills. This is definitely telling the crowd that Chu Han Kao used all the money he got to save lives. Everyone is begging Chu Han Kao not to drop out of the race. The tide of public opinion has turned. Jae-in was completely enraged. He exposed Chu Han Kao for killing 31 people. people, but he found out that his father was also an accomplice. Ju Heman brought the coroner from the autopsy. He said Chu Han Kao commissioned him to do the autopsy, but a cop named Qian Song Huan ordered him to hide the truth, and had the autopsy report revised. And Qian Song Huan is Jae-in's father. The evidence is all there. Ju Heman helped Chu Han Kao turn the tide again. Jae-in went to his father's friend to find out the truth. He told him that they were the first police officers to enter the crime scene. Qian Song Huan realized that the victim's neck was broken. He reported it to Chu Han Kao, who was the prosecutor at the time, but the autopsy report turned out to be a suicide. Qian Song Huan was transferred to the Metropolitan Police Department after the case was closed. He suspects that some kind of deal was made between the two. Jae-in is disappointed in his father, but his peers said something was wrong. Qian Song Huan died in a car accident when Jae-in was a child, but after they investigated, they were surprised to find out most of the police officers involved in suicide investigations died in accidents during that time. They think Chu Han Kao was killed to silence him, and those who weren't killed were Chu Han Kao's mole and the police force. This reminded Jae-in of his sister's death, so he talked to the team leader about Han Sang-ka's murderer. You took the DNA yourself, so you switched the samples? The team leader got agitated and yelled at him for making false accusations. Jae-in told him to watch out. Afterwards, the team leader panicked and dialed a phone number. Jae-in, who was monitoring the call, was shocked. The principal of the police college was his father's best friend. At night, Jae-in asked him to meet him. He asked him to give himself up. He remembered when Jae-in's sister asked him about the mass suicide case, but he chose to tell Chu Han Kao about it. Then Jae-in's sister was killed by Han Sang-ku. The principal asked him to present evidence. Jae-in realized that he wouldn't admit it. Jae-in called his co-workers to expose the recording. Soon after, the daytime call recording appeared on the internet. The principal and the team leader were arrested. At this time, Chu Han Kao's favorability ratings were dropping. It's not because of his evil deeds. It's because the other two candidates have joined forces. Chu Han Kao and the pastor looked at each other. They decided to repeat the mass suicide. Soon the pastor is praying frantically for red rain to fall from the sky in Seoul. At the same time, a group of people turn red. Jin Dan saw the future again. She realizes that all of them will die. Jin Dan followed them all the way. The moment she touched the women, she saw that they would all stand on the rooftop and jump to their deaths. But strangely enough, they weren't Chu Han Kao supporters, nor were they followers of the Qianan Church. They were employees of a company who had been fired. They're protesting against Chu Han Kao's competitors. If these people jump to their deaths at this point, Chu Han Kao will become president. There are only 3 days left before the presidential election. Jin Dan has been searching for the location of the jumping site. The only thing he saw was 2 words that rhymed. The two of them searched all night to find all the buildings with the word rhyme in it. That's when Paek Yoshian called. He said his father wanted to see him, so they decided to split up. Jae-in went to the prison to see Chairman Beek. On his way to the prison, Chairman Beek was killed by Chu Han Kao's men. When Jae-in arrived, Mr. Beek was already dead. At that moment, Paek Yoshian was trying on wedding dresses. He will have no choice but to marry Ju Heman. The news of her father's death was very painful. On the other hand, Jin Dan is not doing well either. She went to all the locations but all of them were different from the building she had predicted. With time running out, she decided to try to turn Ju Heman. She said she was looking for the Popeye from her childhood. She told him that she was looking for the Popeye of her childhood, and told him all about her vision of the future. Seeing that Ju Heman didn't believe in her ability, she told Ju Heman to grab a handful of almonds. And every time, she was able to guess the exact number. Ju Heman believed in her power, but he didn't know about Chu Han Kao's plan. But he didn't want to see the same tragedy happen again. While Ju Heman was in a dilemma, Jin Dan offered him his hand as a symbol of friendship, but Ju Heman felt like he had blood on his hands. He couldn't take that step. Jin Dan left in despair. Ju Heman followed him out. Paek Yoshian was furious at the sight. Paek Yoshian was furious when he saw this. He ran over Ju Heman with his car. Go back in time to before the accident. Jin Dan foresaw Ju Heman's death, so he quickly ran and pushed him out of the way, but she herself was knocked into the air. In the air, she saw the word rhythm. It turns out that she had read it wrong before. The word on the building should be dinosaur. Jin Dan didn't care about his injuries. She called Jae-in to go to the dinosaur museum. Jae-in turned around and rushed to the destination. He called the police for backup. Jin Dan's sacrifice of his life. Ju Heman's heart was shaken. On the other hand, the protesters were tricked into going to the museum. They were expecting to be laid off tonight. Instead, they were met with desperate men. They controlled everyone with weapons. Then they took all the cell phones. Soon the priest enters with a smile on his face, said he was going to open the gates of heaven, and raise them all to heaven. The protesters were forced by the outlaws to record their last words, and the last words are all directed at Chu Han Kao's opponents. Chu Han Kao stares at the surveillance footage with satisfaction. He then raised a glass to celebrate his election to the presidency. At that moment, Ju Heman rushed into the room and asked him what he was doing. Chu Han Kao smiles a perverted smile. He says it's going to rain in Seoul. Jin Dan, who was seriously injured, rushed to the scene. She contacted Jae-in and split into 2 groups. She went to the surveillance room and knocked out the outlaws. Then she gained control of the entire building. Jae-in, under Jin Dan's command, killed the two outlaws. She puts on a uniform and blends in with the hostages. Jin Dan cut the power to the building for a short period of time. Jae-in blended in with the crowd. All the hostages are taken to the elevator to the top floor. The captain followed the procedure and called out to the criminals. The hostages fell from the sky. Everyone called for an ambulance for the hostage. By now, Jae-in has been forced to the rooftop. He tried his best to calm the frightened hostage. Jin Dan arrived just in time. She lit the detonator that Jae-in left for her. The detonator attracted the robbers' attention. The two of them attacked each other and killed them all. Jae-in told Jin Dan to take the hostages away. He stayed behind to wait for the priest. Jin Dan escorted the hostages downstairs and took care of the butler who came after them. The pastor took the two remaining hostages to the rooftop. He realized that things were out of his control. Jae-in showed up for the safety of the hostages. He was shot by the priest. Jin Dan foresaw his death. She rushed upstairs to stop him, but the gun was turned on her. Jae-in jumped to save Jin Dan from a fatal shot. Jin Dan suddenly smiled strangely as if he was possessed by something. Then she said, "No wonder you're acting like a ghost. It's because you're very sick. Your widowed mother told you to keep the family business, but you sold it and started a fake church to make money." The pastor was horrified and asked how she knew. Jin Dan took the opportunity to shoot him. Then the pastor lost control of his body and fell down the stairs. The police arrived on the roof just in time. They brought the other outlaws to justice. Luckily, the bullet didn't hit him. Jae-in was able to save his life. On the other hand, Chu Han Kao realized that the plan had failed and decided to run away in the night. Ju Heman told him not to run. He advised him to go to the scene to maintain order, so that he could get a good impression from the public, because there's no evidence that you had anything to do with it. Chu Han Kao once again believed that Ju Heman could turn things around. On the way to the scene, Ju Heman offered to bring him a glass of rice wine to help him calm down, but they were stopped by several police cars on the way. At that moment, everyone's cell phones rang. It turns out that a video of Chu Han Kao has surfaced on the internet. Chu Han Kao is holding a glass of wine and telling how he planned the whole case, and Ju Heman filmed it all, and it struck him at the critical moment. Just like over 20 years ago, Ju Heman handed him a package of potassium chloride. Let him choose how he wants to leave the scene. Ju Heman left the scene after everything was done. He gave Jin Dan the address of the duplicate video of the mass suicide. A black car stopped behind him. Several men stabbed Ju Heman several times. Then they left him to die. The video of the mass suicide was exposed by the police the next day. Chu Han Kao's method of killing shocked the nation. On the other hand, Paekyeoshan secretly transferred all his assets. He was planning to flee the country. At that moment, Jin Dan brought a document. All of her father's illegal assets were frozen. Paekyeoshan had no way out. Jin Dan also held a memorial service for the victims of the mass suicide, to prove that they weren't fanatics. They were simple, kind-hearted victims. In the orphanage, they only had numbers, and Jin Dan is giving them all their names back today. In the past 2 years, Jin Dan and Jae-in have used their powers to work together to solve major cases. The two of them have developed a strange feeling for each other. Jae-in asked her out for a spring trip. Jin Dan followed Jae-in to a supermarket. Here she saw Ju Heman, who was supposed to be dead. It turned out that Jae-in had arranged the killers that night. The purpose was to make Ju Heman disappear from the world by faking his death, to avoid being hunted by Chu Han Kao's subordinates. Jae-in knew that Ju Heman had nothing to do with his sister's death, so he chose to help Ju Heman. Jin Dan complained that Jae-in lied to her for 2 years, but Jae-in smiled proudly. Ju Heman is enjoying his life very much. His childhood dream was to open a supermarket. The three of them are eating ice cream on the balcony and enjoying the spring colors, enjoying the light after the darkness. This is the end of the movie.